In the town of Ikenoo, there was no one who had not heard of Zenshi Naegu's nose. Dangling from his upper lip to below his chin, 5 or 6 inches long, it was of the same thickness from end to end. For 50 years he had been tormented at heart by the presence of his nose, from his young days as an acolyte until the time he rose to the prospected office of palace chaplain. To others he tried to appear unconcerned about his nose, not so much because his preoccupation with such a matter was not worthy of a man whose duty it was to devote himself ardently to prayer for the advent of paradise, as because he wished to keep from the knowledge of others that he was worried over his nose. With him, his apparent concern was rather a matter of pride, and his greatest dread in every conversation was to hear the word nose. His nose was of course an intolerable nuisance. In the first place, he could not take his meals by himself. If he tried, the tip of his nose would reach down into the boiled rice in his bowl. So at meals he had to have one of his disciples sit opposite him and hold up the end of his nose with an oblong piece of wood about 2 feet long and 1 inch wide. This manner of taking meals was of course no easy matter, for the priest whose nose was held up for his disciples, who held it up. Once a page who was acting in the place of the disciple happened to sneeze and dropped the nose into the bowl. This incident was talked about as far as Kyoto. He could accept the practical inconvenience of having a long nose, but the loss of his dignity on account of it was intolerable. The Ikenoo townspeople used to say that it was fortunate for the priest that he was not a layman, for surely no woman would care to be the wife of a man who had such a nose. Some went so far as to say that were it not for his nose, he might not have taken holy orders. Zenshi exhausted all possible means to make his nose appear shorter than it really was. When there was no one about, he would examine his nose in the mirror and look at it from various angles, taxing his ingenuity to the utmost. Just changing the reflections of the face in the mirror was not enough. Prodding his cheeks or putting his finger on the tip of his chin, he would patiently study his face in the mirror, and not once could he satisfy himself that his nose was shorter. He would attempt to find some consolation by discovering someone with a nose like his own. He delved into the voluminous Buddhist scriptures, but in all the scriptures there was not one reference to a long nose. How comforting it would have been to find, for instance, that either Mu Lane or Sha Lane had a long nose. He did find that King Leo Santi of the kingdom of Chuhan in the 3rd century AD had long ears, and thought how reassuring it would have been if it had happened that the king's nose instead of his ears had been long. One autumn day, a disciple went on a trip to Kyoto, partly on his master's business, and before his returning to Ikenoo, his physician acquaintance happened to introduce him to the mysteries of shortening noses. The physician, who had come to Japan from China, was at the time a priest attached to the Chiraku temple. The formula was a simple one: first to boil the nose in hot water, and then let another trample on it and torment him. At the temple bathhouse, water was kept at a boil daily, so his disciple brought in an iron ladle, water so hot that no one could have put a finger into it. It was feared that Zenshi's face would be scalded by steam, so they bored a hole in a wooden tray and used that tray as a lid to cover the pot, so that his nose could be immersed in the boiling water. As for his nose, no matter how long it was soaked in the scalding water, it was immune from ill effect. "Your Reverence," the disciple said after a while, "I suppose it must be sufficiently boiled by now." When the nose was withdrawn from the hole in the lid, the disciple set about trampling on the steaming object, exerting all his strength in pounding it with both his feet. Zenshi, lying on his side and stretching his nose on the floorboards, watched his disciple's legs move up and down. When his nose was taken out of the pot for the second time, it was found to their great surprise remarkably shorter than before, and was not very different from a normal hooked nose. Stroking his greatly shortened nose, he timidly and nervously peered into the mirror, which his disciple held out to him. "No one will laugh at me anymore," the priest thought to himself. Within the course of several days, however, Zenshi had a most surprising experience. The page who had once dropped Zenshi's nose into the bowl of gruel happened to pass by Zenshi in the lecture hall. At first, resisting his impulse to laugh, casting down his eyes, he could not for long withhold his burst of laughter. The sextons under Zenchi's supervision would listen respectfully while seated face to face with their master, but on more than one occasion they fell to chuckling as soon as he turned his back. Man is possessed of two contradictory sentiments. Everyone will sympathize with another's misfortune, but when the other manages to pull through his misfortune, he not only thinks it safe to laugh at him to his face, but also comes even to regard him with envy. Day after day, Zenchi, becoming more and more unhappy and vexed, would not open his mouth without speaking sharply to someone, and was ever out of sorts. Finally, Zenchi came to feel sorry and even resentful for having had his long nose shortened. One morning, Zenchi, as usual, awoke early. Instinctively, he put his hand to his nose, and what he touched was not the short nose that had been his the night before, but the former long nose that had dangled 5 or 6 inches over his lips. In one night he found his nose had grown as long as it had been previously, and this, for some reason, made him feel refreshed and as happy as he had felt.
Nobody's gonna laugh at me again.